Let me start by thanking our minister for the kind words. My speech today, in a sense, I think much portrays what's been said before, but it's also much about who are we. I'll explain to you in a few minutes what I mean by the gaps. Start a little bit about some of the lessons that I've learned after the 12 years. It's been a fantastic story for me. Speak about inclusive growth. What is it in the end? Going back to Bangladesh. Speaking about the gaps, what is needed for us for the next phase, and then finalizing some of the issues that, or expressing some of the issues that we've been working on in NORFUND for the last year. As I said, I've had 12 fantastic years. Not one day the same. Learning a lot, meeting people, understanding more about countries far away. But one of the lessons that probably stands out more than anything is the fact that my understanding that how you see the world depends on who you are and where you are. When I started to see the world through the eyes of our investees, I realized how different that world was from the one I see from Norway. And that's really the origin of the gaps. But let me explain, once more in terms of how important it is to understand where you are in the world. This guy, seen from Norway and Europe, is seen as a reckless, self-defeating, unexperienced, and unpredictable guy. A guy undermining the Western world order and our values. The best we can hope for is a one-term president. 30 years back, I started working in China. Did a lot of work through the 90s in China, and been following China over the last 10, 15 years in terms of what China does in Africa and other places. And some months back, starting to read about Trump seen from China really surprised me. A very different story. Even President Xi has been criticized publicly for being too aggressive in the South China Sea and needed to take a more modest position towards Trump and the US. Foreign policy analysts in Beijing, they see this guy as a skilled strategist and tactician. They talk about a creative destruction of the existing world order to create a new one, better and more beneficial for US. They interpret his reach out to China as a way to isolate, reach out to Russia as a way to isolate China. They're preparing for an entirely new US for the long term. An entirely different perception of what's going on. Read from two different parts of the world with different backgrounds. This sort of cartoon in terms of Trump's mental maps, I don't know if it's right, but I think from a Norwegian, and then coming back to Norway, from a Norwegian perspective, the troubling thing is that we don't even surface. Our biggest and most important ally for the last 70 years, we're not on his map. And that's hard for us to understand. I mean, we are quite proud of who we are. We've been a fantastic success story in modern times on top of the pyramid. We know quite a lot about the life at the top of the pyramid. We are perhaps the best in the world at the very top of the pyramid. The backdrop of that is that it's difficult for us to understand the bottom of the pyramid. It's so far away. It's difficult for us to understand development. A lot of the issues that Paul Collier brought up in terms of NGOs and our perception, that's what this story is all about. The fact that we are consistently been seen and as one of the best, perhaps the best country in the world, illustrates who we are. But that's also the origin of the two gaps. To me, in terms of financial sector, the fact that knowledge from financial sector in Norway and the West in general of our markets, they're seen as exotic. and perception of risk is highly inflated, but we don't know much about it. So we live in a world where with highly liquid markets, money, big sums of money floating around in our part of the world, don't do much good for anybody except the traders and the filthy rich bankers that can pocket their fees, not being able to move this capital to fund growth in parts of the world that could actually put it in good use. So that's one of the one gap. The other one is the one of the development community. Understanding development in poor countries is what we struggle to do. Very much about Paul Collier's message before. The gap between our expectations and the standards that we set in Norway for what is needed and good and what works on the ground in poor countries. To me, I mean, this is partly explained by the fact that even today, the present aid industry's perception of development was formed during what I call the long decline. 25 years from the mid-70s to the late 90s, these curves show GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa, 25 years of decline from a very low level. So in the aid industry, I mean, many concluded development is not possible. And a lot of people also have took the opinion that business and investment is really the problem, not the solution. We need to fight it. And in the end, aid was less and less about growth and more and more about alleviating short-term suffering, about building institutions, copying what we do in our part of the world, exporting our values to NGOs and foreign-funded so-called civil society. But then also Africa changed, growth came back. Much about foreign direct investments. No country or no region in the world need foreign direct investment more than Africa because local saving is too low. But on the development policy agenda, this was much portrayed in the Addis conference in 2015. Eventually, a new paradigm arose. A public sector needs to catalyze huge private sums to keep the economy growing. The slogan, billions to trillions, billions of aid to unleash the trillions of private capital. And in a sense, the tone of the day was captured perhaps more and better by the late Kofi Annan than anybody else. It's the absence of broad-based business activities, not its presence, that condemns much of humanity to suffering. An entirely new mindset. So then the question, of course, is, so what is needed to grow Africa out of poverty? One of the surprising things to me is that people didn't ask the following question. Why don't we look at the success stories? I mean, the last 3 decades, 4 decades in China and in other places in Southeast Asia, including East Africa, some countries have been able to do it and alleviate poverty. Why don't we go there and try to study what they did and copy it and recommend and use it as a recipe? Because compared to our standards on ESG and human rights, what these countries are doing is all wrong. So for anything in the world, don't copy it. Don't recommend it for other poor places in the world. Let me sort of move the scene and pick up on Paul Collier's Bangladesh story. This is Bangladesh seen from the top of the pyramid, from Oslo. We see Rana Plaza in Dhaka to the left, 8-story building collapsing, 1,100 people killed, or shipwrecks being chopped up on the beach, very poor health and safety standards to the right, or hardworking garment workers in the middle. Low pay, poor working conditions, building codes poorly enforced, trade unions struggle. It's all wrong. I'd like to take you through a different story about Bangladesh. Try to see the Bangladesh through the eyes of this garment worker. Hardworking, young ladies in the garment industry. But let's start with macro figures. This is a country where GDP per capita almost tripled over 25 years. fantastic growth story. It's about building infrastructure, electricity. It's about FDI, much about Chinese investors and other Asian investors coming with their capital and their knowledge in terms of garment industry to Bangladesh. So that's a growth story, but then look at the human part of this. Female labor participation increasing more than in probably any countries in the region. Life expectancy for 25 years increasing for every year, increasing by 7 months. Or child mortality or school enrollment, I mean the number of indicators are many. It's a country with inclusive growth for an extended period of time. That's not what we see, that's what the poor people on the ground in Bangladesh see. That's what the lady here to the right, one of the 4 million garment workers, 90% of which are women. Their perspective, I mean, seen from Oslo, I mean, what their life is miserable. Nobody would like it. 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, $200 a month. I mean, terrible life. That's not how she see it. She see the other lady, the other girls back in the village. Muslim society, married at 13, 14 years, starting to have kids, up in the morning, working on the field, producing and delivering food to the family in the early morning. One of these garment ladies in an interview said the following: for them, the rural girls, it's a cage. My life is much better than theirs because they have no freedom. When I go back to my village and see my friends, they ask me, can you take us with you? This is a kind of development that we don't see from the very, very, very top of the pyramid, but garment workers in Bangladesh experience. Summarizing the Bangladesh story, why this success story? I mean, there's a number of reasons. The garment industry is extremely important, in particular from a gender perspective. The 2 biggest NGOs in the world, Grameen and BRAC, been fantastic in terms of pulling, I mean, in health, education, in the countryside. Just read some time back that BRAC, I mean, just published a report saying they have provided modern toilet services for 60 million people. We don't see it, they see it. And then also the paradox, the political system is highly polarized and dysfunctional, almost like in Washington these days. So it's not, I mean, it's not an ideal political system or democracy, but though, for many reasons, it is a story about inclusive growth. Back to the broader global picture, this is what we used to see. I mean, China growing rapidly for decades, decade after decade. The West is growing at like 2% and slightly coming down. The economy is moving to south and to the east. The African story, of course, was a very difficult one from the early 2000s. Also been performing quite nicely and growing at least ahead of population growth. Bit more bumpy for the last few rows. IMF expect growth to come back, so you'll see also going forward, much better than history. But then I'd like to draw the attention to the next 2 graphs. The red one, South and Southeast Asia, excluding China. It's Philippines, of course, India, whole of Southeast Asia. The growth in Asia is moving from China to rest of Asia. And the rest, and then in Africa, East Africa, Uganda, of course, included, fantastic growth story over the last 3 decades, have been growing like Southeast Asia for the last couple of decades, and is likely to continue growing. So high growth regions, they're still out there, and of course the challenge is to make it inclusive. Back to the gaps, and how can we close them? Well, the problem is we're not closing them. Foreign direct investment to sub-Saharan Africa or commercial bank lending from the West going down. And it started to go down after Addis. So in many ways, I mean, at least at the backdrop of what we read this day about the Sino-African summit in China, $60 billion for development for the next 3 years. The West's global institutions look more and more like paper tigers. Big declaration, it doesn't happen. Why? And let's, in terms of the financial sector, why doesn't it happen? Well, still, these markets are small, they're difficult, and they're risky. Not even worth thinking of taking the toil of going there. But at home, high reputational risk. If you go there and anything goes wrong, it will hurt you quite badly. And in Norway, that's absolutely a factor for some of our partners who decided to turn their back on Africa. And Western bank regulation and ESG standards convincing banks and others to stay out. Let me only very briefly mention Paul Collier's commission on escaping the fragility trap. It's a broad story about what is needed in terms of policy to address the issue. I will only draw attention to the private sector. To cite, the current ESG standards designed for emerging markets are inappropriate for the needs of fragile states, discourage and delay investment, and should be discontinued. Tell you it's a different story from what we hear from our NGOs back home. But that's part of the turnaround. We need to, that's a debate we need to win. On the other hand, we need to deliver a success story in terms of investment, and one of our biggest one is KLP, the biggest pension fund in Norway, investing 1 billion with us in renewable energy, banks, and microfinance. And why with us? Well, because they needed somebody who needed to learn this market, a high growth. In the longer term, they need to reallocate capital to high growth markets. We were the only one they knew and trusted. And we have actually made it a success story. I mean, we deliver returns that should be convincing to other investors. The return equation actually is quite attractive. What was needed to make it happen? Strong leadership. If it wasn't for this man, the CEO of KLP, it wouldn't happen. To turn the tide in the private sector, we need somebody who's going ahead, we need leadership, and we need success stories. This is one. The other gap in the aid industry, let's see how Western aid responded to the new paradigm. ODF is official development finance, which is a bit a broader concept than the traditional ODA concept. Doesn't really seem to make much of a difference or impact after Addis. Everything goes ahead as before. One exception, I mean, the DFIs, particularly CDC. I believe we have Graham Wrigley, chair of the board of CDC here, has been upgraded quite significantly in terms of new capital from its owner, DFID. But Norfund, we have had a fantastic story with our owners, gradual increase, building the capital base, the core capital over time for more or less 20 years, in particular with the present minister. So the only exception to the fact, or the only response in a sense, from West on a policy level to the Addis billions or trillions, it's what's going on with the DFIs. We need more. Bit of a story in terms of development, because and against challenging this idea about standards, because some people seem to believe that if we decide on high standards, they will implement it, and after some time they will look like us. I tell you, that's not how the world look like. Labor market in Kenya, 17% in the formal sector, the rest in the informal. 3% of the formal sector is in internationally owned companies. They have health and safety standards and pension and whatever, similar to what we would like to see. The rest in locally owned companies or public sector, from good to bad in terms of standards. But the rest, no standards whatsoever. No pensions, no nothing. And then the story to me is the following. For us as investor and for private sector investors, for them reputational issues and risk to go to invest with other international investors in a top notch, low risk. If you want to make a difference, It's large-scale investment, pulling people out of the informal into the from the informal to the formal sector, and gradually improving on standards. That's development in the longer term. Now about Norfund and what Norfund is doing, of course, development is about smallholder farmers and small and SMEs, and we do that, particularly smallholder farmers. It's about SMEs growing the medium-sized businesses, and it's about the big one. And it's a ladder, finding a way in a country to climb that ladder, help countries climb that ladder. 3 investments we did last year to illustrate what we're doing. Shuraco in Somalia, people on the ground in Hargeisa, Garowe, and Mogadishu. No Norwegian, because it's difficult for us to have Norwegian go there, to be honest with you. What they do is to provide Sharia-compliant loans, $100,000, $200,000 to local businesses to create employment. To me, a response to the Commission's request, how do we help this country start growing? Because in the end, it is about employment. First investment in Malawi, in the AMA world. Equity investment in a company to grow, slaughter, export, or distribute beef locally. With outreach to thousands of smallholders delivering, selling their cattle to the system, cash crop for them. And the last one, Bujagali in Uganda. It's been mentioned before. And basically what we hope to do is to upgrade the way this plant is operated and provide much more services to the Ugandan grid. We believe that this is where Norwegian competence actually can make a difference. We know how to do that. And we've done it before, particularly in the Philippines. We had a fantastic story in terms of building, upgrading existing hydropower facilities. A bit of a number. I will not go through all of them, but you just read the numbers. End of last year. 292,000 people employed. Our companies buy domestically. We produce electricity to close to 30 million people. And our companies paid close to 10 billion NOK in tax. To me, this is development. This is sustainability. This is the long term. It works. We all often have this criticism at home that our businesses look like other businesses. And I say, yes, of course. They're well-run businesses. They're profitable on the ground. They don't look different. They're just like any other business. No more, no less. So what's the development part of it? How does the mandate, how do we factor in the mandate? In terms of where we invest and sectors. Sectors mentioned before, sectors are particularly important for development. So our board have decided our key performance indicators, pulling our investments to the least developed countries, willing to take on board early stage greenfield risk, much about equity, much about sub-Saharan Africa, and much about clean energy and renewable energy. So if we are able to move our portfolio, deliver on these KPI, have well-run profitable business on the ground, don't ask more. And compared to our peers, I think we actually do deliver on the mandate of poverty. The EDFIs, our European brothers and sisters in bilateral funds, I mean, some of them are like us. This is the average number. CDC, I mentioned before, is much like us in terms of equity. But we skewed towards the poorest place in the world, towards Africa, towards renewable energy. In this graph, of course, for fun, we also included the African Development Bank. They beat us on Africa. So let's end by 2 more slides and look ahead. First of all, the one gap on development. We need to get the better understanding in terms of what development is on the ground. Very often when Western aid comes in and we produce our reports and aid and give them advice, I mean, this is perhaps exaggerating, but I mean, it's not very practical. We don't understand how these kind of farmers, what they need on the ground. And when they ask us as investors come in, well, then we have this ESG standard, so we need to provide protective gear and toilet facilities during work hours. It simply doesn't work. What this guy needs is lending from one of our bank or microfinance to buy a two-wheel tractor. And in a few years, perhaps, hopefully, a tractor and become a commercial farmer. But being part of that growth story is what we need. It's not about setting standard, it's about improving life for poor people. In the long term, our standards. The role of the DFIs, to me, going forward, threefold. We need to crack the code in terms of convincing private investors to go with us in large numbers. If we don't succeed, even if we are capitalized and growing ourselves, we will not succeed in a broader perspective. We need to be more innovative in the poorest places in the world, fragile states and similar. Need to find ways to apply private sector tools that we do in these difficult places to create jobs. And in terms of our core business, it's about poverty, it's about sub-Saharan Africa, it's about deploying our capital in the low-income countries in the world. It's not about investing in China and similar places. They can do it themselves. Thank you so much.